We are covering The Hobbit on Roleplay Riot. We are on part 14. And here's the burglars, said Bilbo, stepping down into the middle of them and slipping off his ring. Bless me, how they jumped. Then they shouted with surprise and delight. Gandalf was as astonished as any of them, but probably more pleased than all the others. He called to Balin and told him what he thought of a lookout who let people walk right into them like that without warning. In fact, it was Bilbo's reputation that went up a great deal that day with the dwarves after this. If they still doubted he was really a first-class burglar, in spite of Gandalf's words, they doubted no longer. Balin was the most puzzled at all, but everyone said it was a very clever bit of work. Indeed, Bilbo was so pleased with their praise that he was just chuckling inside and said nothing about the ring. And when they asked him how he did it, he said, "Oh, just crept along, very carefully and quietly." "Well, it is the first time even a mouse has crept along carefully and quietly under my very nose, and not been spotted," said Balin. "I take my hood off to you," which he did. "Balin, at your service," he said. "Your service, Mr. Baggins," said Bilbo. Then they wanted to know all about his adventures and how they had lost him, and he sat down and told them everything, except about finding the ring. Not just now, he thought. They were particularly interested in the riddle competition, and suddenly most appreciatively at his description of Gollum. "And then I couldn't think of any other question with him sitting beside me," ended Bilbo. "So I said, 'What have I got in my pocket?' And he couldn't guess in 3 goes. So I said, 'What about your promise? Show me the way out.' But then he came to kill me. And I ran and fell over and he missed me in the dark. And then I followed him because he started talking to himself. He thought I really knew the way out, and so he was making for it. And then he sat down in the entrance and I could not get by, so I jumped over him and escaped and ran down to the gate." "What about the guards?" they asked. "Weren't there any?" "Oh, yes, lots of them, but I dodged them. I got stuck in the door. It was only open a crack, and I lost lots of buttons," he said, sadly looking at his torn clothes. "But I squeezed through all right, and here I am." The dwarves looked at him with quite new respect. And when he talked about dodging guards and jumping over Gollum and squeezing through, as if it was not very difficult or very alarming. "What did I tell you?" said Gandalf, laughing. "Mr. Baggins has a good deal more about him than you guess." He gave Bilbo a queer look under his bushy eyebrows as he said this, and the Hobbit wondered if he guessed at the part of the tale that he had left out. Then he had questions of his own to ask, for if Gandalf had explained it all to the dwarves, Bilbo had not heard it. He wanted to know how the wizard had turned up again, and how they'd all gotten out. The wizard, to tell the truth, never minded explaining his cleverness more than once. So he told Bilbo that both he and Elrond had been well aware of the presence of evil goblins in this part of the mountains, but their main gate used to come out on a different pass, one more easy to travel by, and therefore caught more people near the gates. Evidently they had given up going this way, and the goblins must have opened their new entrance on top of the pass the dwarves had taken, quite recently, because it had been found quite safe up until now. "I must see if I can't find a more or less decent giant to block it up again," said Gandalf, "or soon there will be no getting over the mountains at all." As soon as Gandalf had heard Bilbo's yell, and he realized what had happened, in a flash which had killed the goblins that were grabbing him, and he had nipped inside the crack just as it snapped to. He followed after the drivers and prisoners right to the edge of the great hall, and there he sat down and worked up his best magic he could in the shadows. "A very ticklish business it was," he said. "Touch and go." But, of course, Gandalf had made a special study of bewitchments of fire and lights. Even the Hobbit had never forgotten the magic of fireworks at old Tuke's Midsummer Eve parties, as you remember. The rest we all know, except that Gandalf knew all about the back door, as the goblins called the lower gate, where Bilbo lost his buttons. As a matter of fact, it was well known to anybody who was acquainted with this part of the mountains. but it took a wizard to keep his head in the tunnels and guide them in the right direction. "They made that gate ages ago," he said, "partly for a way to escape if they needed one, partly as a way out for the lands beyond, where they still come in dark and do great damage. They guard it always, and no one has ever managed to block it up. They will guard it doubly after this," he laughed. All the others laughed too. After all, they had lost a good deal, but they had killed the great goblin, and a great many others besides, and they had all escaped. So to be said, they had the best of it so far. But the wizard called them to their senses. "We must be getting on at once, now that we're a little rested," he said. "They will be after us in the hundreds when night comes on, and already the shadows are lengthening. They can smell our footsteps for hours and hours after we have passed. We must be miles on before dusk. There will be a bit of moon. If it keeps fine, then that is lucky. Not that they mind the moon much, but it will give us a little light to steer by." "Oh, yes," he said in answer to more questions to the Hobbit. "You lose track of time inside goblin tunnels. Today's Thursday, and it was Monday night or Tuesday morning we were captured. We have gone miles and miles and come right through the heart of the mountain, and now we are on the other side. Quite a shortcut, but we are not at the point to which our pass would have brought us. We are too far north, and we have some awkward country ahead, and we are still pretty high up. Let's get on." "I'm so dreadfully hungry," groaned Bilbo, who was suddenly aware that he had not had a meal since the night before last. Just think of that for a hobbit! His stomach felt all empty and loose, and his legs all wobbly, now that the excitement was over. "Can't help it," said Gandalf, "unless you'd like to go back and ask the goblins nicely to let you have your pony back and your luggage." "No, thank you," said Bilbo. "Very well, then. We must just tighten our belts and trudge on, or we shall be made into supper, and that will be much worse than having none ourselves." As they went on, Bilbo looked from side to side for something to eat, but the blackberries were only in flower, and of course there were no nuts, not even hawthorn berries. He nibbled a bit of sorrel, and then he drank from a small mountain stream that crossed the path, and he ate 3 wild strawberries that he found on its bank. But it was not much good. And still they went on and on. The rough path disappeared, the bushes and the long grasses between the boulders and the patches of rabbit-cropped turf, and the thyme and the sage and the marjoram and the yellow rock roses all vanished, and they found themselves on top of the wide, steep slope of the fallen stones and the remains of a landslide. When they began to go down, this rubbish and small pebbles rolled away from their feet. Soon larger bits of split stone were clattering down and starting other pieces below them, slithering and rolling. Then lumps of rock were disturbed and bounded off, crashing down with a dust and a noise. Before long, the whole slope above them and below them seemed to be on the move, and they were sliding away, huddling all together in a fearful confusion of slipping, rattling, cracking slabs and stones. It was the trees at the bottom that saved them. They slid into the edge of a climbing wood of pines that stood right up to the mountain slope from the deeper, darker forests of the valleys below. Some caught hold of the trunks and swung themselves into lower branches. Some, like the little hobbit, got behind a tree to shelter from the onslaught of the rocks. Soon the danger was over, and the slide had stopped, and the last faint crashes could be heard, and the largest of the disturbed stones went bounding and spinning among the bracken and the pine roots far below. "Well, that has got us on a bit," said Gandalf, "and even goblins tracking us will have a job to come down here quietly." "I dare say," grumbled Bombur, "but they won't find it difficult to send stones bouncing down on our heads." The dwarves and Bilbo were feeling far from happy, and they were rubbing their bruised and damaged legs and feet. "Nonsense! We are going to turn aside here at the path of the slide. We must be quick. Look at the light." The shadows were deepening about them. though far away through the trees, above the black tops of the growing lower down, they could see the evening lights on the plains beyond. They limped along as fast as they were able to, in the gentle slopes of the pine forest in a slanting path leaning steadily southwards. At times they were pushing through the sea of bracken with tall fronds rising right above the hobbit's head. At times they were marching along quiet as quiet over a floor of pine needles. And all the while the forest gloom got heavier and heavier, and the forest silence deeper. Then there was no wind at evening to bring even the sea sighting into the branches of the trees. "Must we go any further?" asked Bilbo, when it was so dark he could not see Thorin's beard wagging beside him, and so quiet he could hear the dwarfs breathing like a loud noise. "My toes are all bruised and bent, and my legs ache, and my stomach is wagging like an empty sack." "A bit further," said Gandalf. After what seemed ages further, they came suddenly to an opening where no trees grew. The moon was up and was shining into the clearing. Somehow it struck all of them as not at all a nice place, although there was nothing wrong to see. All of a sudden they heard a howl away down the hill, a long, shuddering howl. It was answered by another away to the right and a good deal nearer to them, then by another not far away to the left. It was wolves howling at the moon, wolves gathering together. There were no wolves living near Mr. Baggins' hole at home, but he knew that noise. He had heard it described to him often enough in tales. One of his elder cousins, on the Took side, had been a great traveler and used to imitate it to frighten him. To hear it out in the forest under the moon was too much for Bilbo. Even magic rings are not much use against wolves, especially against the evil packs that lived under the shadow of goblin-infested mountains. Over the edge of the wild, on the borders of the unknown, wolves of that sort smell keener than goblins, and they do not need to see you to catch you. "What shall we do? What shall we do?" he cried. "Escaping goblins to be caught by wolves," he said. And it became a proverb, though now we say, "out of the frying pan into the fire," in the same sort of uncomfortable situations. "Up the trees, quick!" cried Gandalf, and ran to the edge of the glade, hunting for those that had branches fairly low, or were slender enough to swarm up. They found them as quick as they could. Guess, and up they went as high as they could trust the branches. You would have laughed from a safe distance if you had seen dwarves sitting up in the trees with their beards dangling down like old gentlemen gone cracked and playing at being boys. Feely and Keely were at the top of a tall larch with an enormous Christmas tree. Dory, Nori, Ori, Owen, and Glowin were more comfortable in a huge pine, with regular branches sticking out at intervals like the spokes of a wheel. Biffer, Boffer, Bomber, and Thorin were in another. Dwalin and Balin had swarmed up to a tall, slender fir with first few branches were trying to find a place to sit in the greenery of the topmost boughs. Gandalf, who was a good deal taller than the others, had found a tree in which they could not climb, a large pine standing at the very end of the glade. He was quite hidden in its boughs, but you could see his eyes gleaming in the moon as he peeped out. And Bilbo, he could not get into any tree, and was scuttling about from trunk to trunk like a rabbit that has lost its hole and has a dog after it. "You've left the burglar again," said Nori to Dory, looking down. "I can't be always carrying burglars on my back," said Dory, "down tunnels and up trees. What do you think I am, a porter?" "He'll be half-eaten if we don't do something," said Thorin, for there were howls all around now, getting nearer and nearer. "Dory," he called, and Dory was lowest down in the easiest tree. "Be quick and give Mr. Baggins a hand up." Dory was really a decent fellow, in spite of his grumbling. Poor Bilbo could not reach his hand, even when he climbed down to the bottom branch and hung his arm down as far as he could. So Dory actually climbed out of the tree and let Bilbo scramble up and stand on his back. And if you want to hear about the wolves coming through, that'll be in the next section. Thank you for watching Role Play Riot.